Welcome to Six Pines, a quaint mountain town nestled in a quiet forest, where intriguing locals and myths spark curiosity. Discover delightful eateries and friendly neighbors for those seeking both charm and adventure. Six Pines. Hey guys, welcome back. It's Miss Mini Life, back with another video in our town building series. This one took a little while. One of the reasons this one didn't come out as quickly as I thought it was going to is because I did a lot more planning for this build. I made tons of patterns and I went through several different builds to test everything out. There was a lot of pre-planning and work that went on before I got to something I was happy with, and you'll see that in a second. But another reason it took a little bit longer is because I tried out a lot of techniques that I've never tried out before. Let me show you guys with a reference how small this thing is, because we are still building in N-scale. So let me show you guys. Ta-da! Smooth! Let me show you what just happened. Yeah, so being an artist while clumsy is really hard. This is the first neighborhood that I'm doing for the town, and I feel like this is where the town is really starting to have a little bit more character, because the first one was just a construction site and the last one was the sawmill. If you want to catch those, I'll have a playlist with all of the other videos. But yeah, I'm really excited to show you guys how I made this, so come with me and let's start the build. So first of all, I am drawing out a sketch of what I want to build, and this is a lot more than I actually did for either of the first two videos in this series, but I felt like I needed more clarity on what I was actually building with this one, so I'm doing a quick sketch. Now I'm going to make all of the pattern pieces, and I'm trying to keep everything pretty simple. I started out using grid paper, and I like doing things by hand and then scanning them into the computer, although sometimes I will just make everything in Photoshop or GIMP. When I do it by hand, it lets me just see everything next to a ruler, so I have a better idea of the size. I made a paper model of this just to make sure everything matched up, and it's good that I did, because nothing matched up. Everything was off a little bit except for the overhang. And I also realized that the scale ruler that I got from printablrulers.net was actually printed incorrectly, and I think that that was throwing everything off a little bit too. I decided to just use a ruler and millimeters instead. 2 millimeters equals a foot in this scale, as some of you guys pointed out in my previous videos comment section, so thank you very much for that. Now this second paper model fits together a lot better and everything looks like it's matching up. I'm gonna do one more model out of the materials that I'm using to build all of the houses, because it's a lot thicker than paper and I need to make sure the pattern still works. This stuff that I'm using right here is called chipboard, and it's basically cardboard, but it's the kind that comes on like the back of a notebook or a cereal box or packaging. It's not corrugated like your moving boxes. And I'm using a removable glue stick to just temporarily put on the pattern pieces and then remove them after I've cut everything out. And then I'm permanently gluing everything onto the paper printout for the roof texture and the siding. The last test is complete. Look at all these tests. All right, we are ready to make our real houses. So I printed everything out to try and make everything a lot easier. I have the siding, the roof texture, some windows, and then I went ahead and pre-cut out all of the walls and all of the openings for the windows and doors in advance. I did a lot of research on working with this scale and making tiny buildings. One of the hurdles to overcome was figuring out the siding for the houses. The best method that I found was printing out textures, and I made this texture in GIMP and then I just made a pattern of it to fill up the whole sheet. One of the things I had to do was add some lines to the back because it was really easy to glue the pieces down incorrectly and have the front be misaligned, and I couldn't really see where the lines were, so I just drew some guidelines and glued across those. Now I'm cutting out each individual wall piece, and I'm leaving spaces around the edges so that I can fold the paper around the corners of the building. I'm making an X in the center of each opening, and that is because I learned this trick where you can wrap the paper around the edges and that'll make the edges look super neat. It ended up being a little bit pointless because I made windows that go on the outside of the building and cover up the edges of my windows. But in case you do any building and you don't do that, that could be really helpful. My trick for the windowsills is using label paper. I printed out the windows onto that and then stuck that down onto some plastic. Then I cut out the interior parts of the window and peeled that part up. And that let me get some nice thin lines because if I tried to cut paper and glue it down in those tiny little strips, I don't think I could do it. I started putting the walls together and then I wasn't happy with the texture of the roof. So I decided to cut some strips of the same texture paper that I made and do some lines of that. That gave the roof a little more texture. I made some roof dormers to go on top of one of the houses because I was tired and I forgot to cut out the pieces for the other houses. So only one has some little bits on the roof. So yeah, there you go. Moving along, I have this piece of foam board. This is used for insulation and you can get it online, but you can also pick it up at the hardware store. This stuff is good for making bases. Actually, it's pretty good for making all kinds of things, but I'm using it for all of the bases in this build. I'm laying out the houses to see where I want them to go, and I also noticed that the base is a little bit thick, so I rigged up this situation right here to try and trim down the foam using my hot wire cutter. A foam cutter table would be perfect for this, but I only had a handheld wire cutter, so this is how I cut the foam anyway. And then I just trimmed off the little bit of extra that was on the side. I'm using wood glue to start and mixing in some black paint, and then I'm gonna be adding some sawdust to this, and that's gonna give me a nice muddy base for the ground of the neighborhood. And I really liked using the sawdust in the previous build this way, so I just kept up the same thing with this one. I know, I'm really lucky to have a neighbor who does woodworking who has gifted me a ton of sawdust for free, but I'll link to some because it is good for a lot of different crafting purposes. Try to get it for free first, and if you can't find it, then I have a link down in the description. I'm also using some static grass, and these fibers were a little bit too long. In the previous video, I used them as is, and I felt like they threw off the scale a lot. So I'm just putting them into a little medicine cup and trimming them down. They were way too fine to go into like a food processor or a grinder or a spice grinder. They just floated around in there. So I have to do it this way, but it definitely got them very, very fine, and it's gonna look a lot better now that they're chopped down a lot shorter. The mud texture is all dry, so I'm using a colored pencil to mark out the sidewalks, the house placement, and the little footpaths up to the doors. Since I didn't scuff up the top of the foam before I put down the glue, I could peel up the parts of the mud texture that I wanted to remove pretty easily, and then I glued down the houses. I decided I had to glue them down at this stage because if I glued them down after I put down the grass, they weren't gonna be flush and there was gonna be little gaps underneath where the grass went under the houses and it was gonna look super weird. While I was painting the sidewalk and the driveway with gray acrylic paint, I realized I forgot the stairs for the front of the buildings. I didn't plan for them and I didn't cut any out, so I quickly cut out some chipboard strips and glued them one on top of the other in a stair shape, and then stuck those in the front of the houses. I'm covering the area where I want to apply static grass with some wood glue that I've watered down. The static grass is the only grass that I had. It actually doesn't really matter that it's static grass in this case because I'm not going to do anything to it to try and make it stand up other than turn the diorama upside down and tap the back of it. That gets rid of the excess, and that also just makes the fibers stand a little more upright. Since I'm constantly trying out different techniques, I wondered what it would look like if I just dry brushed some green paint over this texture. Because it's so small, I realistically don't think you would see a lot of individual grass blades anyway, and I love how that looked, so on certain parts of the diorama I just left it like that. But the green paint also made a good base for the static grass on some areas of the project. I've made a ton of trees so far between the last 3 build videos for this city, and I'm sure I'm gonna make hundreds more. But the thing that I did differently with these trees is I tried dipping them in paint instead of spraying them with my airbrush, because I didn't want to crack the airbrush out and I wanted to try it out and see how it would work. I just dipped them in some green paint that was watered down, and then I set them on a paper to dry. I also decided to try and add in some bark for the bottom, and that's just brown paint and wood glue and a little bit of cornstarch. Once those were dry, I started placing them using some super glue and poking holes in the diorama to stick the trees in place. I didn't have a set location for each tree. I just looked around and tried to fill up the gaps as best as I could. This time around when I made the trees, I tried to trim them down much closer to the wire center, and I think that makes the trees look a lot more realistic and also fixes some of the scale problems that I had in the previous builds. So this one turned out a lot better and a lot more foresty than the last two. I felt like it needed one last thing, so I added some telephone poles to the front. I guess I forgot to film that part or the footage got lost, but I used basswood for the poles, and I used some of the fibers that I used to make trees or the cables going across the top and painted them black. Thank you so much to my patrons Lori, Ryan, Fred, Lisa, Nicole, and Jordan. Shout out to you guys, and to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you so much. Here's the finished results. Guys, I feel like I'm getting a lot better. They could be neater, but I really think like my skills are improving with each of these builds, and I can't wait for the next one, and I have a couple of really fun ones in mind, so stick around. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can get notified when the next ones in the series come out, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you. Bye.